What the Tech is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. For a free trial and 10% off, go to squarespace.com and use offer code WhatTheTech10.
What the Tech?
Hey everybody, welcome to What the Tech. I'm Andrew Zarian, enjoying this nice glass of red wine here on the second part of the Paul Thurrott Chronicle series we're doing here on the GFQ Network. I'm joined by, of course, the man of the hour, Paul Thurrott. How you doing, Paul?
Sure. Pretty good. How are you?
I love the fact right before the show, for people listening to the podcast, we talk for a couple of minutes prior to the show. We engage like human beings. We don't just show up and do a show and leave. Some other radio shows. I know a lot of radio show hosts hate each other, like Scott and Todd
right.
here in New York.
Well, to be fair, I did compliment you while sort of, digging at you a little bit.
You told me that my wife has class and that I don't.
Well, I didn't say it quite like that, but
you alluded. You alluded to it.
She
is
did
full of class.
question what she was doing with you, but
I said she's very classy and educated, and I'm some brute from Queens. I mean that's really. Yeah. I'm drinking red wine. I feel fancy. I have this goblet next to me. Look at this thing. It's gigantic. But nice. We actually do talk, and I totally forgot what I was saying, to be honest with you.
You were going to, before the show, we were talking about, wine and drinking, and we decided to drink. I think.
Yes,
I don't know if
that's what I was going to. Exactly. Now, I don't even remember, but we're going to be drinking today.
Because you're a drunk.
Yeah.
Clearly
really.
You have a drinking problem.
It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon here on the East Coast, and we're going to start drinking wine. So please join us. If you're at work, perfect place to start drinking, if you ask me. Why bother waiting till you get home? Have a glass of wine. Go to the fridge at your job. There has to be wine at your job. So we're gonna be drinking. This is part 2 of the interview. We're at 1995 right now in Paul's career. That's where we're going to pick up.
Wow.
We left off in 95. Windows 95 had launched. I believe we went through some of the feelings and emotions that had to do with Windows 95, which there were a lot of feelings and emotions. I have a lot of feelings about.
It was a good time.
It was a very good time. Too bad that ended with Windows ME, which I'm dying to reach that point with you about ME. But before we start the show, I want to get the ad out of the way. I want to talk about our advertiser, and I want to thank our advertiser, and that's Squarespace, the fast and easy way to create a high-quality blog, portfolio, website. You could create a tech blog. You could create a podcast. Actually, I rarely talk about this, but they have a great platform for podcasters. I believe Sword and Laser, Tom Merritt's podcast, is on Squarespace, and it's amazing, actually. And the reason why it's really good is that you don't really have to create an app to be on, iOS or Windows Phone, because the site totally scales. So no matter what platform you're on. So if you're on, a Windows Phone device, if you're on a tablet, if you're on a big, gigantic 30-inch monitor, it's going to scale. And it's going to fit that screen. You're not going to have any kind of weird compatibility issues. The other great part about Squarespace is that not only do the blogs and the themes that they provide you look phenomenal, they also have a really, really advanced backend. The code in the backend is really written from the ground up, and it complements the front end also. So if you're creating your website, it's going to be SEO friendly. You know that it's going to get crawled on Google, on Yahoo, on Bing, all these other platforms. They also offer 24/7 support, which is great, 7 days a week. So if you have a problem, someone's there to answer the call. And the plans start at $8 a month. Here's a great deal that they're offering our audience, our amazing audience here at What the Tech. Start a free trial with no credit card required. And you can build the site out by going to squarespace.com. When you decide to sign up for Squarespace, because I'm sure you will, you get 10% off when you use offer code WhatTheTech10. And it helps us out, and it shows that you're supporting the show. That's squarespace.com, offer code WhatTheTech10. You get 10% off. I want to thank Squarespace for supporting the GFQ Network and, of course, this wonderful show that we're going to begin right now. And we're going to pick up at 1995, Paul. So so Windows 95 comes out. You told us. I mean, the most fascinating part of the interview for me was that you draw, and I had no idea about that. And I got so many emails.
I was fascinated to find out what was fascinating. Yes,
I had no idea. The audience didn't know, and they really
Yep.
found it interesting that
Okay.
you draw, and it's actually cool because Mary Jo revealed when we did the interview with her that she went to culinary school and she was going to become a chef, which is
Right.
really cool. I can't cook or draw, so I envy both of you. So 95 is here. Windows 95 is released. This totally changes the game when it comes to the personal computer because now it's friendly to everybody.
Well, it's getting there. Yeah.
I mean, but for the most part, I mean, you go into this beautiful UI. It's pretty looking. It's not this complicated,
Sure.
DOS interface that a lot of people were used to in the prior years with a lot of these OSs. And you know what's interesting though? We're talking about like when we talk about Windows 95, we say like that's what began the PC revolution. That's what brought a PC into everybody's house. If you were the everyday person that you probably didn't have a computer, but now you did.
No, I mean, it certainly catapulted it to a new level of success. I mean, I think Windows 3 was a big, big deal. I have very strong memories of going to my dad's house in the early 1990s and buying with him and installing whatever new version of MS-DOS was out at the time. There was a kind of a sequence of MS-DOS 6 point whatever releases where they added things like double space, and then they had to take it out because the company that actually made it sued them or whatever, and then they did their non-infringing version. And MS-DOS was still kind of an ongoing concern, obviously, and was the underlying part of the OS. And Microsoft was big back then. I just wasn't a user or a fan. But yeah, Windows 95 took it to a whole new level, definitely.
So the fascinating part is that now the discussion that we have is how it's not the PC that's for the everyday user. It's a tablet, right? Like we talk about the Surface and we talk about the iPad as being that device that you give your grandmother or that aunt or uncle that doesn't really understand computers. So it's almost like we've dumbed it down to an extent, but we've come a long way with the product. I don't know what's better, to kind of not know the back end and to use it and to be happy, or to learn the overly complicated stuff and to attempt to delete System32 files.
Sure.
Because I know a lot of people that tried to do that. What was your feeling about Windows 95 when it was released, to kind of recap this? Your initial impression, like, did you think initially that it was going to be this like crazy melee to buy it, and it's going to be those amazing press shots where the people are holding it up like this?
Sure. No, I mean, there was no precedent for that. I mean, what I can tell you is that from my own perspective, coming to the PC world from the Amiga, and having gone through these things where I found Windows 3.x to be lacking. I found Windows for Workgroups 3.1 to be lacking from a user experience standpoint, but interesting technically. I was a big fan of the OS2 stuff and what they were doing, and I think a lot of Amiga guys went that way. But there's only a small segment of people listening to this who will understand what I mean by this. But the latter day Amiga stuff, they came out with the 2.x operating system and firmware. It was a beautiful system. It took all the wonderful technical stuff from previous versions forward and just made it nicer looking. And honestly, nothing matched that to me until Windows 95. And when I saw Windows 4.0 as it was called originally, I realized Microsoft finally got this right. They finally have something that isn't just playing catch up, that isn't just what Apple did 5 years ago or what Amiga did maybe more than 5 years ago. It was modern and beautiful looking and usable, and that was a big change, and it was important. So I knew Windows 95 was going to be a big thing, and not the consumer sensation that it was, but a big thing for computers, and a big thing for me personally.
At what point? When did you start writing the Windows Secrets books?
Well, that came much later. I mean, the genesis of that is that I had been writing books for many years to this, well, almost 10 years to that point. And Longhorn was coming, and Longhorn was going to be a big deal. It was 2003, and I think it was actually before the PDC, which was the big explosion of stuff for the PDC. And I went to Wiley, which was the publisher of that stuff. Brian Livingston had written all of the Secrets books up until Windows XP, which is kind of interesting because Windows XP became like the biggest release of Windows ever, right? But for some reason, he looked at Windows XP and he wanted nothing to do with it. and he walked away from the Secrets books. And so they went with some other author, and whoever that person was wrote a very small book. And I've never read it, but apparently it didn't sell well. I don't want to say it was low quality, but it just didn't do well. And I only learned about that because sometime in 2003, probably in early 2003, I contacted Wiley, who had published some books for me at the time. I did Windows XP books around networking, around home networking and digital media. And I said, I want to do a Longhorn book. And potentially I want to do a Longhorn Secrets book. And they said, it's interesting that you contacted us at this time because the first time I contacted them, they said, you can do it if you do a new version of the XP Secrets book. That book had gone horrible, and they wanted a new version. And they wanted it really quickly.
And it was someone else that had written it.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they said you can take all the information they already wrote and incorporate it into a new version if you want, or you can start over from scratch. Your idea. And I had a bunch of guys that I thought maybe could help me with this. We talked about it, but Wiley needed it very quickly, and I just said no, I can't do that.
Had they done like Windows 98 Secrets and Windows 95 Secrets prior to that, or was XP the first one that they attempted that?
XP was the first one that whoever it was, I don't know who it was.
Okay.
Livingston had written one for Windows 3, Windows 95, Windows 98. Windows Me, and Windows 2000. Maybe not Windows 2000. I think Windows Me was the last one. And actually, it might have been Windows Me that turned him off to it. I think the Windows Me book did horribly, as you would imagine.
Yeah.
And I think he kind of walked away from it. So some number of months went by, and Longhorn was obviously going to be a huge thing again and again. So I went back and I said, listen, I really want to think about doing this Longhorn Secrets book. And they said, it's interesting that you contacted us again because we just heard from Brian Livingston, and he actually wants to do, he sees that it's going to be a big deal, and he wants to do the Longhorn Secrets book. And so I got together with him, and I had met him before. I'd met him during the Windows Me stuff. He went out on like a publicity tour, and we talked about it, and we ended up splitting it 50-50, like we would do the book together. And of course, Longhorn unfortunately turned into Windows Vista, and we kind of went from there. So
okay, so because Longhorn, I'm sure it's going to take a lot. So Windows 95 now.
Yep.
Windows 98 is out. What was your initial impression of Windows 98? Because it was almost like that whole Vista and Windows 7 thing, where Windows 7 felt like a complete version of Vista.
I think what we could do is summarize that from Windows 95 or 1995 through say 2000, 2001. Microsoft advanced the state of the art with Windows 9X as much as they could. Through updates to Windows 95, they had the OSR series of those. They had Windows 98, which I looked at as a chance for Microsoft to kind of get, fix the problems, fine tune it. I thought for the time it was a much improved version of Windows. And then on the flip side, the NT was also happening. And as someone who was still very much involved in software development and getting into web development in those, the mid 1990s, I was very interested in Windows NT. We used NT as the basis for our web server at Big Tent, the company I was working for. A friend and I, Joe, worked on that, did all of the kind of system administration stuff on NT. Learned that, I liked NT a lot. I wrote an NT4 book as well. And NT, of course, became Windows 2000 eventually, but the gap between Windows NT4 and Windows 2000 was pretty big. It was about 4 years.
Yeah.
And Microsoft was during that time advancing Windows 9X, more frequently. So that stuff was kind of happening.
Let me ask you about ME. What happened there? Like what went wrong with ME?
Well, you know what? Not as much as people think. The weird thing about Windows Me is that it was not going to happen. Windows 98 SE was going to be the last version of Windows on the old code base.
And then
Windows
they were going to NT after that.
Yeah, so Windows 2000, Windows NT 5.0, was going to be the release of Windows that combined the two code bases. In fact, it's the reason that the SuperSite for Windows exists. In fact, the SuperSite for Windows was literally going to be a site dedicated just to that one version of Windows.
Windows 2000.
Windows NT 5.0, okay. Because, before it became 2000. And at the reviewers workshop for that event, which occurred in August 1998, my son had just been born, 4 or 5 months before that. So this was the first trip I took since he was born. And I remember leaving my wife and kid at the airport and thinking, I'm a bad parent and I'm leaving them or whatever. And I went to Seattle and we learned about what they were doing with Windows NT 5.0. We're very excited about it. And so I created the SuperSite not as an ongoing concern, although here I am, whatever this is now, 15, 16 years later, still doing it. But I made it to be just a standalone, almost like a website as a book kind of a thing. I'll cover this one topic as much as you can, and then I'll move on to something else. I had other websites I was working on. I had been covering the future of Windows for a few years on another website. And the reason it's called the SuperSite, it was originally called the Windows NT 5.0 SuperSite. It was just going to focus on that one thing, and it was just going to stand there and be done. At some point it would just be done.
I remember when it was like a weird thing that so many people went to Windows 2000. Like you could go and buy a computer and it was Windows 2000, but Windows 2000 was kind of it was enterprise. It wasn't.
Well, yeah. So
the consumer product.
So a bunch of things happened right up front. So I got all excited about this release of Windows. First, they changed the name. They got rid of the NT name. And by the way, they did it 2 months after this reviewers workshop. I remember being hugely disappointed by that. We're not going to call this thing NT. It's just Windows. We're going to call it Windows 2000. So I thought that was kind of a betrayal of the NT name, which I still believe stands for something. It certainly did stand for something important, something meaningful. The other thing they did was they pushed back their plans to integrate the two code bases. All of the stuff that they had told us originally about this thing being a superset of everything that was available in Windows 98, everything that was available in Windows NT 4.0 fell by the wayside because they needed more time to get that happening. And that's why Windows Me happened, because now they have this gap between 1999 and 2000, and they wanted 2001 when Windows XP came out. And so they wanted to have another consumer release so they could have another Christmas or a back to school season where they had like another release. And it's hard to remember the details off the top of my head, but the way I would put this is Windows Me was a lot like Windows for Workgroups 3.11, where there were technologies in it that later became part of Windows XP that debuted in that version. And so the two that I'll just pull off the top of my memory, because people forget this stuff, are System Restore, right? The ability to set restore points and go back in time, so to speak, and have everything but your data files go back to the way they were, which is a very handy reliability feature. And also driver rollback. People forget this today because it's 2013, but 20 years ago, if you installed a bad driver on Windows, and meaning Windows 3X, Windows 9X, you could not boot Windows. Like it was over. There was no way to recover from that. You had to reinstall Windows if it was a certain kind of error. And so with driver rollback, you could actually recover from what used to be a fatal error in Windows. It's one of those things we don't think about anymore because they fixed it 15 years ago now. But Windows Me had those features. It had other features too. It also had these notions of activity centers, which was this kind of user experience thing that Microsoft was working on for quite a while. It was the first operating system to have those. The complex kind of integrated media center product is a good example of that. But they were going to have media center or activity centers for photos, for music, for burning CDs, and it was all going to be wizard based and wonderful and all that kind of stuff. And so Windows Me was a weird interim release, and it did some low level stuff that we later saw. Again, in NT-based versions of Windows. But it also had some, didn't get rid of DOS, but it skipped over DOS in a way that people thought Windows 95 did, but didn't. So it actually had some technical stuff in there that really demoted DOS to a point where it was still there. Yes, of course. It was like DOS 7 or whatever they called it.
But why all the issues with ME? I mean, why did they have a lot of the stability issues that, became notorious with the brand? I
don't know. All I can tell you is my experience with Windows Me was always fantastic. And I literally benefited from driver rollback on more than one experience where I know that this previously would have destroyed Windows.
Actually, what turned me off to it, and I'll remember because I went and I installed Windows 2000 literally a couple of weeks after I got this computer. I would blue screen all the time, and obviously blue screens are hardware issues. But when I tried to roll back to my restore point, it corrupted the restore point. Yeah. So I had a friend. He's like, I tried Windows 2000, and he had a CD from his job, and I put it right in, and I never looked back after that. I mean, that was it.
Well, right. So, depending on the hardware you had and all that stuff, I mean, Windows Me would perform much better than Windows 2000 on, older 9X class hardware. Windows 2000 was much more secure, much more reliable, all that kind of stuff. And, the writing was on the wall.
But I mean, there were driver issues also with Windows 2000. A lot of things were not supported.
I mean, NT timeframe, NT4, when I was running NT4, I used to have to print out part of what they used to call the hell's not the right word. It was the hardware compatibility list, because you couldn't just go buy anything at Best Buy and have it work. You had to know it was going to. There were NT drivers, so NT4 timeframe 96, 97, whatever. You'd print out that part of the list, and then you would go and you would buy the thing.
Is your beer here?
My beer delivery service.
Very nice. So were you posting that on your Win SuperSite at that point?
No, so the SuperSite started in August 1998, right after that Reviewers Workshop for NT 5.0. I called it the Windows NT 5.0 SuperSite, and Microsoft contacted me, as they did other people that had websites with the name Windows in the title, and they said, "Look, we don't mind using the name Windows, but it just can't be the first word. So you need to rename it, and our recommendation is that you call this thing the SuperSite for Windows NT 5.0. And so you're not, obviously not going to fight.
And then what were you going to plan on doing? Like every year, make it, the SuperSite for Windows NT 6.0.
I had no plan for that. My initial thought. See, I was already writing broadly about the future of Windows on a different site, and I thought I was just really excited about this release, and I thought this would just serve as kind of a standalone thing. I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I did rename it, and then they changed the name, and then they announced Windows Me, which back then was called Millennium, the code name Millennium. They also had a product codenamed Neptune that was floating around at the same time. And Neptune was like an NT 5.1 release, and the thought was maybe this will be the one that combines the two product lines, or maybe Neptune will bring the activity centers that are also being planned for Millennium to the NT code base, and it was all kind of up in the air. So,
but it seems like over the evolution of Windows 2000, the lifespan of it became more consumer friendly.
No, not really. But I mean, XP was the one that did that. But for a little while, they had this notion of Windows 2000 for business, Windows 9X/Me for consumer. That was kind of the way they broke it down. And so the first thing I did was change the name of the site just to SuperSite for Windows, because I thought, well, okay, there's this consumer stuff happening with Millennium and with Neptune, and I'm interested in this, and that this will be a way I can continue this discussion. And these things are sort of related, And then over time, obviously, it grew. So you started writing about other versions of Windows, Office, related products. Eventually, it kind of expands into like, well, here's what the competition is doing, and you can sort of see how.
Refresh my memory here. When around that time, right? I remember going into like a CompUSA and seeing just a lineup of consumer computers.
Yeah.
Ooh, I think my my package is here. Okay. I remember.
Leo, let's settle down.
Yeah, I'm getting excited. I think my package is here.
Let's not interrupt the podcast for an Amazon package.
I'm going to get up and I'm just going to walk away at one point. But
you're right. I'll just keep talking.
Yeah. I remember going into a store, and the longer Windows ME was out on the market, the less these stores had computers with Windows ME, and it became all Windows 2000. And as someone at that point that kind of knew that 2000 was enterprise and ME was consumer, I found it interesting that it was becoming all 2000. And was that because of the reliability, obviously, of the operating system, or was it the consumer confidence in ME?
Yeah, we now have 3 examples of versions of Windows that just tanked with consumers, right? So Windows Me was the first one, Windows Vista was the second one, and now Windows 8 is the third one. And I don't remember exactly for Windows Me. I don't remember. The one thing let me tell you, I can tell you many stories, obviously, but I can tell you and I think I wrote about this eventually at some point, but one of the odd things about the time frame of Windows Me was that I had really good insider access to what was going on with that product. And what I mean by that is I actually could log into a system and look at where they were in the development of the product, what the bugs were, what the showstoppers were. And so every once in a while, I would publish a little post where I'd say something like, here's the current schedule. They expect to hit this milestone on this day, this milestone on this day, and maybe they'll release it on this day. And of course, these things would kind of adjust over time because Microsoft's internal schedule would always change. And of course, you'd have people on the outside saying, oh, Thurrott's pulling these dates out of his ass. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And I actually had literal direct access to what they were doing. It reached the point of the absurd when the person who was the beta administrator, and this was a woman whose name was Amanda McClellan, but she actually hid her identity during the creation of Windows Me, and I don't know if she's still at Microsoft anymore, but she used to log into the beta groups, which I also had access to, by the way. And then she would tell people, because they would say, Paul Thurrott's writing this thing like that, you're going to release it on this day and you get this going on. And she told them that he has no idea what he's talking about. That's not what's happening. And I was literally looking at the same dashboard that she was every morning. Like, she was lying to people on the beta program about what I was writing, and I knew exactly what they were doing. Like, that was literally the best internal access I've ever had to Microsoft ever. I might as well have been an employee. And she outed herself. She used to call herself Skeeter in the beta groups, for some reason. She never told anyone her name. And she finally got outed like after the beta was over. And I believe I wrote an article about this at the time because I was just so infuriated with this woman and how shoddy that treatment was. But, there were various, we didn't really have bloggers back in this time frame, but tech writers who would, oh, Paul Thurrott wrote this thing about the release date, but Microsoft tells me that's baloney, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, actually, sorry, guys.
Do you still battle that with your site where you'll get some, you'll post, it's the right information, but you'll get all these websites that say, no, Paul Thurrott doesn't know what he's talking about.
I think I've hit the point now where people realize that, I'm
you know what you're talking about.
If I write something, I'm pretty sure about it. And obviously things change. I mean, there's no doubt that things change.
How did Win SuperSite gain popularity and traction?
Well, honestly, I think in the early days it was that kind of insider access, and I would write about these things, and then they would happen, and people would be, oh, this guy actually seems to know what's going on. And I think a track record kind of develops over time. It's not anything you can plan, but it's something in my case that certainly happened, and it helps to be right. I guess
I'm looking at a blog on Win SuperSite from. Let's see, July 5th, 2000. The Road to Gold, the development of Windows ME.
Yeah.
It's amazing that you have all this archive still. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's all there. Yeah.
So you're doing Win SuperSite now. At what point does it become, pretty big? Right. Because it's actually one of the more successful blogs. I mean, it's a very popular website. People know it. You say Paul Thurrott, people know Win SuperSite. How does it get? Like, when did it get to that point?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, some of the important things to know about are that in August 1999, a year after that reviewers workshop, I moved back to Boston, and I don't remember the dates anymore, but not so far after that. For work, I traveled to Israel to consult with this company, and I randomly met with this guy who was from Mainsoft, and he was trying to get recruited into the tech companies in Israel's version of Silicon Valley. And the guy who ran the company came in and he said, this is really random, but he said, there's a Russian programmer in here who works for Mainsoft, and he's telling me about a project they're working on for Microsoft, and I think you want to hear about this. And so I went in there, and they had to have a Russian translator. And this guy was working on a version of Office for Linux in 2000. I think it was 2000. And, I wrote about it. And that's one of those things like people read this and like, yeah, sure. It sounds like complete Linux, sounds crazy. And of course, it never happened. But I mean, the reason it never happened is because Linux never took off as a desktop operating system.
At that point, was it kind of assumed that it was going to start, it was going to take
Microsoft
off?
Obviously believed it was going to happen. And
I think a lot of people still believe it's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I remember I walked downstairs in our first house in Dedham, and I said to my wife, I said, I feel like I'm going to see one of those little red lights appear, through the window or something. And I said, if something happens to me in the next couple of days, I think I know why. And that was a little bit of interesting kind of behind the scenes stuff. But that when we moved back to Boston, the guy who I got contacted by a guy from what is now Windows IT Pro, was Windows NT Mag, and they asked me if I'd be interested in doing a newsletter for them, and I said yes. And then a few months later, the owner of the company, not the owner, the guy running the company, contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in having them buy my site and having me come on as an employee. And so I looked at doing that. Yeah. Well, they're going to buy the SuperSite. They're going to buy WinInfo, which I was still doing the news newsletter. And the way we eventually worked it was that I wouldn't become an employee, but I would become like a kind of a contractor. They would pay me royalty based on ad sales and so forth. And so I started doing that in probably January 2001. And so for 10 years, I think for 10 years, that was the arrangement. And they hosted the site and own the site. They supply the ads and they do the back end technology and and I stopped doing the web development part of it.
How different would it have been for you now if you still had to do the ad sales and the back end stuff? Would it be? I mean, it's very difficult. It's not easy.
No, but I obviously I do wonder sometimes because the arrangement I have now is I get a very minority portion of the ad sales. And it's been very lucrative some years, but that also means that they're getting a lot more of it than I am, And so I do sometimes wonder if it was like a two-man operation where someone did the ad sales and the back end stuff, and I just did what I do, that I would probably make more from it. But, my relationship with what is now Penton, because it was Duke Publishing in the early days and they got bought by Penton, has, been overwhelmingly positive, I would say, for the most part. And the truth is, the guys who are on the team not guys, most of them are actually women, but the people who are in Fort Collins, Colorado, that I work with, and I'm now an employee, are fantastic people, and I enjoy being with them, and I like the relationship, and and it's mostly been very good. So it's worked out. But yeah, I do wonder. Sometimes you have like these really good months, and it's like, this could be a lot better than it is. Yeah. But it's certainly worked out. I mean, it's certainly worked out.
Let's talk about Windows XP. Yep. Obviously, a fan favorite of many PC users.
So XP
still
was
to
a big
day.
one for me. I mean, I was I didn't have direct access to Microsoft anymore. They eventually fixed their vulnerabilities or whatever. But I did have really good sources, and so I was the first person to write about a lot of stuff that happened with XP, and I was the first person to reveal the code name of XP, which was Whistler, and how the next one was going to be Blackcomb, and that both of those things are mountains that are ski mountains near Microsoft. And at some point they realized to get from Whistler to Blackcomb they were going to need more time, and so they needed an interim release. And if you look at the mountains, there's a little lodge that sits between them called Longhorn, and so they codenamed the interim release Longhorn. And Longhorn was originally going to be one of those tiny little 0.1 releases, and then it grew, as these things often do, into something completely different, and then Blackcomb eventually just went away.
Why the shift from the 9X series to XP? What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, I mean, they originally wanted to do this with 2000. They couldn't make it happen, and so they did it with XP. XP eventually went on to become a very big deal. I mean, the early versions of XP, codename Whistler at the time, looked a lot like Windows 2000. They were futzing around with the look and feel of it for a while, and eventually they went in a crazy different direction, right? Remember the big, the blue and green UI that they eventually came up with. And the original plan there was they were going to have all these different themes. I think they shipped in box with just two really weird color schemes. It was like silver and light green. It was really, really strange colors. But it was hard to come up with these color schemes that worked everywhere, and looked good. And they were going to eventually put those out as some kind of add-on packs, and it really basically didn't happen. I mean, of course, they shipped a few. But
like how they had Plus for 95, 98.
Yeah, they were originally, the plan was to have all kinds of different colors, And if you look at the way Windows 8.1 is today, where you can change the color scheme,
still the same idea, yeah.
I mean, they've been wanting to do that forever.
That's interesting. So what was happening on the Apple front? Like, what was your impression of what was happening with OS 10 and Apple?
Right. So that stuff impacted me greatly as well, because on the side of this stuff, you've got Steve Jobs coming back to Apple in 1999. You've got them. They went through some weird revolutions. They were doing Rhapsody for a while. I mean, people forget this. They had Yellow Box, and I think Blue Box was the other one. And I actually got from Apple and ran briefly on a Pentium laptop, like I think was like the only external Yellow Box release that they did. I was always fascinated by Unix and Linux, and this system was based on Unix, and of course the Mach microkernel, and they had this genius Ave Tavanian, who's long since gone from Apple, who I really respected, and I always looked at that stuff as being very, very interesting and a viable alternative to Windows. And Mac OS 10. The original version, I want to say, shipped in early 2001, probably March 2001, somewhere around that time frame.
Yeah.
It was incomplete, obviously in the beginning, and you couldn't burn DVDs and things like that. But they fixed that thing very rapidly, and I was always fascinated by it. I bought an iBook that year to run Mac OS 10 on, and in the early days it defaulted to OS 9 or 8 or whatever they were on at the time, probably 9. And you could dual boot and stuff, and these things evolved over time.
But I mean, OS 10 was a big leap for them. It was totally different than their prior versions.
Yeah, but it was their NT, right? Like, this was something they needed to do, and it really was their NT because it was a completely different operating system, but they made it look and then start to work with some of the stuff that people were familiar with. And so I thought that was a very interesting way to go, and I always follow this stuff very carefully. And Apple, of course, gained prominence over that decade, very much so toward the end of it. But the iPod came out at the end of 2001, and I got a review unit of that from Apple, and was really blown away by that. It was super expensive, but it's an Apple product. And then the rest of it's history. But Apple did, because they were kind of the minority player in the PC space, they moved much more rapidly than Microsoft. And they hit certain milestones well ahead of Microsoft. I mean, they did things like hardware-accelerated graphics in the operating system 5-6 years before Microsoft. I mean, long time. And, of course, they were able to refine it over time because the first time you do it, it's muddy-looking and weird. And, they kind of fix it over time. And then Microsoft comes out 5 or 6 years later, and they're making the same exact mistakes that Apple had made in 2001, 2002. So that was always very interesting to me.
As far as at that time when OS 10 came out, what was Microsoft's, I guess, mindset as far as, what this is and how they're reacting to it? Were they kind of surprised at this? Because OS 10, I mean, listen, if you ask me, I don't think OS 10 was refined until 2008. I didn't like anything pre-Tiger.
Well, okay.
I was not a fan of it.
Okay. Well, a lot of people were okay with it, but Microsoft adopted a different tact with OS 10. I mean, there was an infamous phrase that Bill Gates had said about, I think, Next Step. And I think Steve Jobs had come to Gates and said, "We want you to put Microsoft, Office on Next Step." And I think I don't want to speak out of turn, but I believe what Gates said was, "Develop for Next Step. I'm going to piss on Next Step."
Why?
He was really blown. It was really kind of a harsh reaction when Apple bought Next Step and Next and Steve Jobs. Their reaction changed, and they actually went to OS 10 pretty quickly. Obviously, they made that browser. Well, that browser might have been on OS 9 only. I don't remember. But, they had a browser on the Mac. They had a media player on the Mac. They had MSN Messenger on the Mac. And, of course, they had Office on the Mac, which was the important one. And they still do. And they never wavered in that. I mean, they might have gone back and forth about whether they were going to do it. But there was always a version of Mac Office. And they adopted Mac OS 10 pretty quickly at Microsoft. But I think they could do that knowing that Mac OS 10 was never seriously going to compete with Windows. It was never going to be more than 10%, right? It was going to be 5%. It was going to be 4%.
I mean, in reality, it would be virtually impossible for them to kind of take market share away, right? There would need to be a total shift in this concept of legacy.
Yeah,
I mean, everything. Yeah. The reason why Microsoft has relied on kind of keeping everything kind of the same is because of legacy. They have to support everything in the past. And look at the turnout now. I mean, look at the reaction people have had to Windows 8. It would be impossible.
The world has changed, but you got to remember going back to 2001, whatever, that Microsoft had just come out of the antitrust trial and they had lost, and then they settled, And they needed to prop up Apple because they needed to have some kind of competition in that space. There were things that happened along that decade. I mean, Longhorn was this thing that became very, very exciting and was going to be a big deal, and then wasn't. And during that time, Apple was able to come out with iTunes and the iPod, and then different iPods, and then iTunes for Windows and the iTunes Store, and things started snowballing for them in the consumer space. Right at this time when Microsoft was stumbling very badly for a variety of reasons. They gotten too big and complex, but they were also kind of hobbled by the antitrust stuff.
Yeah.
So it was, there were a lot of things going on.
Let's go into the antitrust stuff. But before we do, I'm going to take a little in-house ad for us here. Okay. We do a big fancy words here, Paul. We're enjoying I'm enjoying a nice glass of wine. Paul, what are you drinking? I never asked you.
I am actually drinking Sam Adams Oktoberfest, which is, they make a seasonal 4 times a year.
Yes.
This is always by far the best one. This year's version of it is fantastic. And Sam Adams is easy to get all around the country, so I recommend it highly.
Excellent. If you want to support the GFQ network and What the Tech, obviously, we welcome it, and we have this little Amazon link on the side of the player here, and of course on our website at gfqnetwork.com, we have an Amazon link there. You can click on it there, and from every time you buy something on there, we get a tiny little portion from the sale, by a couple % here and there, but it helps us out when we're doing upgrades to the studio. So I encourage you guys, click on that thing. It helps us out, and I could get stuff like this. I got the 520, and I can do a review of it, which I will be doing right after the show.
Packaging.
I know it's really weird.
It's funny. I mean, I've gotten this from I bought this at the AT&T store, and that's not what the packaging looked like when I got it.
So I'm going to be doing this right after the show, so hang tight. I know Paul's going to want to tell me what to do on this thing, because I probably have no idea what to do on this thing. So we'll be doing that after the show. So let's continue with this. So the antitrust stuff. You're obviously covering Microsoft to the full extent at this point. What was the feeling there? I mean, what did you think the outcome was going to be? Was there any real significant threat as far as splitting the company?
Yes, absolutely there was. In fact, this was something, the antitrust trial changed everything for me. It required me, someone who was sort of I think we today would say like a tech blogger, but we didn't really have that term back in the late 90s, early 2000s, but into someone who had to understand legal terms, and antitrust law and the Sherman Antitrust Act and what it meant, and how this could transition to this modern age. And it was a real learning process, just like it must have been, if you think about it, for the people who were experts in those things, had to grasp the technology that Microsoft was creating and how that might apply, to their field. It was a very strange thing. And the couple of things that I learned throughout this was that Microsoft was a company that grew very, very fast, and they never stopped acting like that young upstart. Even when they were suddenly the dominant force in their industry, they kept acting like this little spry little young company, which is completely inappropriate when you're a dominant monopoly. They absolutely acted in illegal fashion. They absolutely should have been broken up. And the one thing I will tell you is that if you look at all of the crazy stuff that's going on today, Microsoft's products, its shareholders, its customers would all be better off if that company had been split up into multiple parts, and that should still happen.
In what way? Like how would,
because that company is too big and too complex and too slow moving to get out of its way, and too set in its ways to change itself in a substantive way that it needs to do to compete with companies that are newer, in the case of Google, or just faster moving because they almost died, like Apple, and they just can't. They can't compete with those companies.
But
they're just not.
What division should have been split up? Should Enterprise been split into separate divisions?
That's the thing. I mean, so back in 2000, the way they were talking about it was that operating systems should have been split from apps. Like that's how they would have said it at the time. And I think that's kind of a fair thing. I think when you look at Microsoft today, the company is way bigger than it was at the time. It's way more diversified into too many businesses, many of which make no sense at all. And I look at things like, the Xbox and Bing And online services versus kind of on-prem, old-school type software. I mean, I think there's multiple ways you could split this company up. But I think today, 2 ways wouldn't be enough. I think you almost need to split it into like 4 or 5.
It's interesting how that argument is not. Well, some people argue that Google is far more dangerous than Microsoft ever was.
Oh,
they're far larger of a monopoly than
Yep.
Microsoft ever was. But why is the argument not there for them to split up? Is it that we're in a different era and it's totally different now?
No, I make that argument almost every day.
You do, but I mean, you're not hearing
Google
it all over
needs
the place.
That's a company in desperate need of oversight. I mean, I think the irony of this is that when you look at the actual market power that Microsoft had, say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, compared to what the impact that Google could have on everyone's life, everyone on this planet is impacted by Google. Microsoft ran roughshod over an industry which sold 200 million computers a year. Google runs roughshod over an industry that sells 2 billion devices a year, or soon will, and impacts people who will never own a traditional computer because they live on the savannah in Africa or the jungles of the Amazon or in the middle of nowhere in Southeast Asia or whatever it is, because they have a phone and they interact with the world through Google services. I mean, they have an insidious connection to our lives. You know, when they're just gathering data behind the scenes and churning it out and earning money on advertising. Google is an evil corporation that needs to be stopped.
But it's amazing how they got to that point. I mean, this was virtually a company with no...
Part of it was they were born when Microsoft was in trouble.
Yeah.
And people, it's a new thing. And they were like, oh, this is great.
I mean, think about it. That they're a company with no... At that time, I mean, they only had one source of revenue. They have no product. They just did the browser.
By the way, they still only have one source of revenue.
Google,
Google's revenues, 95%, come from advertising.
And by the way, it's a dying platform for revenue for them. It's slow. It's shrinking. It's slowing down. I mean that.
So they're not quite as big as Microsoft, but it's only a matter of time. They will be as big. They'll be bigger than Microsoft.
Oh yeah, I mean.
And the other thing that happens is these. Obviously Apple dates back to 1976, I think, and may even slightly predate Microsoft. But so these companies are contemporaries. But the truth is, the Apple that we see today was born out of the ashes of a company that almost died in 1999. And frankly, we should think of as a new company, and because they certainly behave like one. And so actually, Google and Apple are contemporaries. And these are companies that if you look at that past, I guess we're talking about 13, 14 years, their growth trajectory is far sharper than anything. Microsoft came to dominance over, say, a period of 20 years. These guys came to dominance over a period of 10 years. And so things accelerate over time. And it's a problem because people may look at Google in some slice of time. For example, the U.S. government a couple of years examined Google's ad business and said, they're not that dominant. We're going to let them buy DoubleClick. If you looked at them just a year later or today, I think that decision would go in a completely different direction because Google's trajectory is so sharp. And I think that's the failing of slow-moving regulatory entities in the U.S. government or governments around the world, that they don't understand how this has changed. Microsoft to them was fast because Microsoft, compared to the U.S. government in the 1970s, was very fast-moving. Google and Apple, past decade, compared to Microsoft, is the same thing again. It's just way faster. It's a different world.
It's a totally different world. Now, let's talk about a soft spot for both you and I, and that's Longhorn.
Okay. Is what?
Longhorn.
Sure.
Did the antitrust stuff have a effect on, or was that part of the reason why Longhorn did not happen? And for people who have not seen Longhorn, I'm sure 99% of our audience knows exactly what we're talking about. This thing was the OS of the future when they unveiled this thing and they showed it off, and little did we know that it was just a video and it wasn't real product. It was actually one of the most impressive things I had seen as far as computing goes, and
awe-inspiring.
It was. It really, like, even now, like, I talk about it, and it's so weird to say that. Like, I get goosebumps when I talk about Longhorn.
Yeah,
because
and
I
to this
remember
day, people still come to me and say, "Oh my God, if we need to go back to Longhorn, if they could just get that right,
But it was just. First of all, we can't ever go back to that. It'll never happen, and it's actually looking dated now. When
by
you
the
look
way,
back.
today that stuff is all horribly out of date. I mean,
sure.
Anyone
who
thinks that that's something to look forward to is mistaken. I mean, we've moved forward to mobile devices and phones and.
But I mean, for
services.
the time, I mean, they had the thing that blew my mind was the phone call system that was integrated in that thing, where people could call you and you could answer it on the phone. It took years. What was that? That was weird.
What happened?
Oh boy, hold on. Go ahead. Hold on.
I wasn't saying anything. Well, I was going to say, so, today we obviously have those kind of capabilities through Skype, and that makes a lot more sense in the world of today than does integrating with a traditional phone system. But that's part of the reason why.
Sorry, Paul.
That's okay. The Longhorn vision of 10 years ago was cute for the day, but really kind of is it's obsolete. It's old fashioned now.
We have a candle lit here, and the glass, the holder just cracked, and I heard a big
did it
pop,
really?
and I'm like, this thing's going to explode any minute, so I had to pull out
You don't
the
want to be
candle.
like that, like one of those goofy TV ads with the car explodes.
No. You know what? If I have a camera here, I could have just pointed it right to it. It would have been a captivating broadcast. But when they were showing all that stuff off, I mean, it was really mind-blowing. The call-in system was fascinating to me. There were so many aspects to it. So,
By the way, they had a sidebar. And a sidebar, as they envisioned it for Longhorn, was going to be like a notification center. It's like a key aspect of every mobile system on Earth, except the ones that Microsoft makes. And they eventually came out with a really weak sidebar for Windows Vista. It had nothing to do with the original Longhorn sidebar. And to this day, Microsoft still doesn't have this central notification center. This is something they talked about literally 10 years ago.
They kind of tried it with Vista too, right? They had that.
No, but it wasn't the same thing.
It wasn't
completely
no.
different. Completely
So
different.
what happened? I mean, you're doing a coverage for this thing. Obviously, you're really excited to cover it. At what point do you realize this thing is falling apart and we're not getting?
Well, so they were always actually pretty quick. So the first indication actually occurred at PDC, that PDC 2003. So almost exactly 10 years ago now. We sat in the audience and everybody was blown away by this. And it was a rock concert. It was amazing. And then they were going to give us the first developer preview build of Longhorn. And instead of this gorgeous glass, awesome activity center, blah, 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 we got this thing that looked like Windows XP with the most horrible skin on it. It was awful looking. It was gross. And nothing worked, and it was terrible. And that was the first. That was, I think, build 4051, if I'm not mistaken. It was just horrible.
But were they saying like, okay, you're going to get it?
Yeah, right. I mean,
You'll get it later. Yeah.
But, we didn't get it later. And we got a couple of interim builds over time. There were events, WinHack would occur in the spring. And I don't remember how the PDCs laid out at the time. But, every year or two, they'd have a PDC, whatever it was. But you could tell something was wrong. And what was wrong internally was that the Microsoft Windows specifically had grown to the point where their previous way of doing things didn't scale. And so if you imagine that Windows is made up of kind of components, though it wasn't actually componentized at the time, you'd have these guys in group one working on the sidebar.
Yeah.
Those guys over there are working on networking, and those guys over there are working on the shell, and these guys are working on that, and blah, blah. You could, 20 teams or whatever it was. Longhorn had like 50 teams. I don't know, 76 teams, whatever the number was. And the idea was that these guys were all going to insert their code into this thing,
and it's going to work.
Compile it, and it was going to work. It never worked. It never worked. And, they had that kind of dawning realization over time, like, this is not working. And, there were projects, by the way, that grew out of that frustration, MinWin and the componentization that eventually did occur with Windows Vista first and later with Windows 7.
But I mean, like a lot of things, like WinFS didn't even happen.
No, but WinFS, WinFS wasn't WinFS in the beginning, right? So WinFS was sort of like going to be this object-oriented. Well, it wasn't WinFS. Before WinFS, it was like an object-oriented file system, OFS. And, we were going to get rid of drive letters. We were going to get rid of the NTFS. We were going to do all these things. And, WinFS grew out of a desire to make SQL Server essentially the file system. It made a lot of sense. They did like core work in SQL Server to make this happen. I mean, I don't remember that. I'm going to get some of this wrong. So if anyone's a SQL guy, they can harp on the details. But the way it works out is that, SQL Server, the early versions, the Microsoft versions of SQL Server, supported discrete data types. And then at some point they needed to add support for kind of it's like object-oriented programming, just like it could be any type, and that this was going to be the start of how we were going to get it to be part of the file system. They supported blob storage and, faster access for file system type access. The SQL Server is going to become the backend for Exchange, even though the Exchange team hated it. It was going to become the basis of the file system, even though the guys in Windows were like, this is never going to work. And there was a lot of argument back and forth, but they worked on this thing for I don't know, 4 years.
Yeah, it was a long time.
And finally, Jim Alchin had to, humiliatingly go to Bill Gates and say, you're gonna laugh when I tell you this, but this thing we're doing is not going to work, and we need to start over. And they literally need to start over. And
they started over, and they put Vista out really quickly.
Yeah, Vista took about a year and a half, not even a year plus 2 months, something like that.
Generally it was 3 years, right? They did the 3 year cycle.
Yeah, it was every 3 years. And of course, when you get Vista, people are thinking, okay, it's been 5-6 years since you did Windows XP. We had interim releases of Windows XP, of course. We had Media Center versions, tablet PC versions. We had Windows XP Service Pack 2 and all that. But a lot of people looked at Vista and said, seriously? I mean, aside from the fact that this isn't a big enough leap, and you've created this huge, slow, ugly-looking thing, you showed us this stuff that looked awesome.
What happened
3 years ago? Why does that not look like this? It's like there's a great gag on The Simpsons where Homer Simpson builds a grill, and you're looking at what looks like the grill, and he's like, "This is a beautiful grill," and then you realize he's looking at the box. And he lowers the grill, and there's this destroyed mess of pieces sticking out of concrete. And he says, "Why doesn't mine look like that?" And that was like Vista, right? I mean, Vista was not what everyone expected.
I mean, when Vista came out, they also were battling the disaster 64-bit was with no support. Yeah, sure. I mean, it was a mess for them. Not only did they have, Vista that was a problem and it wasn't what they wanted, they also had the whole 64-bit debacle that things were not compatible and it wasn't working properly. And
there's some interesting one of the things. So if you go back to that very first the NT 5.0 reviewers workshop where I started the SuperSite, I talked to Yusuf Mehdi at that show, and he kind of is the big guy in Xbox now. And I said, hey, is Dave Cutler around? Dave Cutler being the architect of Windows NT. And he says, yeah, he said he's still working on stuff, but he's not going to be at the show. He doesn't like to talk to press or reporters, whatever. And I said, what's he working on now? And he said, oh, he's working on 64-bit. And I got to kind of think back at the time, but I said, oh, you mean, and I probably said Digital Alpha or whatever the 64-bit, I think this might have even been pre-Itanium. I don't remember exactly. And he said, no, it's something else. And what he was working on was the thing that became AMD 64, which became X64, which became mainstream 64-bit computing. And Microsoft supported very loosely 64-bit versions of XP late in that development. And then, of course, Vista had it. And the recommendations for Vista was you want to go 32-bit. And then for Windows 7, it changed at that time.
Yeah, but they also had a lot of Peter W. in our chat room brought up an interesting thing. They had like Celeron processors with 512 megs running Windows Vista. Also, the whole netbook thing. I mean, you got to remember that towards the end of Vista's life, you had that whole.
There's a lot of stuff. There's way more than that. I mean, they had ultramobile PCs.
Yeah,
ultramobile PC was an 800 megahertz Celeron running on 512 megs of RAM, just like you said. Teeny, 7-inch screen, underpowered, 2 hours of battery life, terrible.
Was it a nightmare for you?
There were phones and there were watches, and then of course there were netbooks.
How difficult was it for you to cover this stuff? Because it was a pretty good run for Microsoft as far as the releases of these operating systems, and then Vista comes along. As a journalist, what was it like for you?
Well, you got to remember. So just for me, from the perspective of SuperSite, by the time Windows Vista happened, I wasn't writing just about Windows. I covered everything. And so even though Windows Vista was something that people weren't necessarily excited about, there were new versions of Office. There were these other things that Microsoft was doing. Zune occurred in the same time frame. That was very exciting for me, even though it was a terrible ripoff of the iPod. And, they did all these different things. There was always something. Microsoft worked on various versions of their Windows Media codecs and versions of that software that was going to compete with iTunes. They, Zune and the iPod. They did all kinds of stuff. Some of it lasted for a little while. Some of it came and flashed and went very quickly. But there was always stuff going on. I mean, I think it's obvious in retrospect that Microsoft was ceding ground to faster moving companies. But it was slow, and Microsoft was really the center of personal computing. It's the reason I got involved with the Microsoft stuff back in the mid 1990s. I loved the Amiga. It was dead. I loved OS2, but it was clearly not going to make it. Microsoft was it for computing. It was very clear. And Windows 95 made it easier for me to digest that kind of a hairball of Microsoft because Windows 95 was great, but, for the day.
Yeah.
You could push that forward 10 years, and overall, the story was still pretty great. It's only obvious now in retrospect how things were changing. There were a lot of people who really liked the Mac, but the Mac never exceeded 5% market share around the world. It did in the United States, right? I think in the United States, probably 10 or 8 years ago, it was probably like 10%. Today in the United States, it's probably close to 20%. But you could always make this claim that Microsoft was at the center of everything. But things start chipping away. The iPod expanded into 4 different versions of the iPod, and so they sold really well. Obviously, I think the iPhone was the wake-up call for everybody, and people maybe forget this, but recognizing what a big deal the iPhone was, and realizing what a piece of crap that Windows Mobile was. And I have incredible stories about those boobs that ran Windows Mobile. That was an incredible waste of time and effort at Microsoft doing Windows Mobile.
So let me jump to that, and then we'll kind of come full circle here, but
okay.
Because I'm realizing we're running out of time again, and we can't do a part 3 to this.
Okay.
It's way too much information.
Sure.
Windows Mobile now at this point. What was
Windows Mobile was a joke?
Was there an end goal? Like, I understand that they like, in a weird way, I feel like they had this meeting and it was like, what do we need to do to get Windows on a phone?
Windows Mobile is the ultimate example of old Microsoft, and it was a product that we have to call it Windows because everything we do is Windows. It can't really compete with real Windows because that's the center of everything we do. So it's got to be really hobbled, and let's make it look like Windows as much as we can. So they went through all the stupid stuff with start buttons and start menus and yada yada yada. But Windows Mobile was an acceptable alternative to like PDA type solutions like Palm OS and things like that. It's when the smartphone stuff started happening that Windows Mobile kind of went south. And in the early days, and there were name changes and all that. I don't want to worry about too much about the details, but in the very early days, there was a separate version of Windows Mobile for phone, and it was one for PDAs, and then eventually became one thing. But the one thing I'll never forget is my final meeting with the Windows Mobile guys, and they all had these Palm devices. There was that one Palm Treo that ran Windows Mobile 6, whatever. They were all very proud of this thing. The only way you could buy it was to spend $600 out of pocket. There was no way to get it at a carrier, and there was no way I was doing that. And I asked them, I said, the iPhone had come out, so this might have been late 2007 or maybe very early 2008. I don't remember exactly, but I said, the iPhone is killing you guys. I said,
what are you going to do?
How are you going to address this? And this is before 6.5 came out, so I don't know, you can do the math on the dates. I don't remember exactly. But I'll never forget this woman. She said, well, the iPhone verifies what we've always said, that if you offered people a compelling multi-touch experience, that consumers would embrace that. And I said, well, actually what I said was, do you even hear the words that are coming out of your mouth? I said, you don't make the iPhone. So if you knew this was going to happen, why didn't you make that device? I mean, you're taking credit for something that another company did. They're killing you. And it was one of those weird moments. I've had a couple of moments in a room with a guy from Microsoft or whatever it is, where I usually sit there and I take notes and I type away and I listen, I nod my head and I ask questions and stuff. And every once in a while, you'll not much. I mean, but every once in a while there'll be this moment where you're like, really? Like really?
For me,
and
Windows.
This was the one where I was like, I almost had to be taken out of the room, where I was like, you people are losing it.
I mean, for me, Windows Mobile. When you do this comparison, obviously the iPhone, but if you compare it from like the way that they intended it to be used, or it kind of ended up becoming that, it's closer to Android, because you look at HTC and they were taking Windows Mobile.
That was obviously part of the problem and part of the thinking behind Windows Phone. But I will say, those guys, they did eventually do Windows Mobile 6.5. There were some friends of mine from the Windows team who had moved over to Windows Mobile, and I remember I was joking with them about how they were being punished for something. I don't remember, and there were some good ideas in 6.5. You know, there was some stuff in 6.5 that's still not available on Windows Phone and is only sort of available elsewhere, where you could kind of picture a home screen where maybe you had calls or you had text that came in or emails that you missed or whatever it was. There were like 4 or 5 different items. And you could swipe on that item, do your PIN, and when you went into the phone, instead of going to the home screen, you would go to that place in the phone. So if you swiped on the text message, you'd go to text messaging. And that's actually a legitimately good idea. The problem is that once you got past that really very basic Surface UI that they had created just with 6.5, it was still Windows Mobile. And Windows Mobile was designed to be tapped with a stylus, not to be hit with your fingers. So all the little UI elements were too small for your fingers.
When that was out and you were writing about Windows Mobile, obviously, and when the iPhone comes out,
well, I stopped using Windows Mobile. I used the iPhone.
Oh, you dropped it totally.
And that first summer, especially, I wrote extensively about the iPhone and how it interoperated with the Microsoft stuff. I wrote about Mobile Me, which I was like, this is Exchange ActiveSync for normal people. I mean, this is exactly what the world should be like. And by the way, is now for everybody. I had people writing me in a lot. I was saying, this is supposed to be like the SuperSite for Windows. Why are you writing about this Apple stuff so much? And the reason was simple, because as a Windows user, this is the phone you should have been using. This was the best one on the market by far. There was nothing coming out of Microsoft that could compare to it. And it took them, 3 years, right, to come out with the iPhone, which at the time seemed like a long time. I think, we can look at BlackBerry and say, actually, it could have taken longer. And obviously, they came out with what I think is a very credible product. Technically, it hasn't yet taken off in the market the way I would have liked. But once I saw Windows Phone, that was the end of the iPhone for me. I mean, I prefer Windows Phone.
I mean, yeah. I mean, Win SuperSite at this point, Win SuperSite at this point is everything. I mean, you cover pretty much anything and everything that's happening in technology.
Okay, but I will say, who knows about the future, but I do try to approach, if I write about something that's Android or the iPhone or whatever it is, I try to approach it from sort of a competitive perspective. How does this compare to what Microsoft offers, and does this or does this not pose a problem for Microsoft, because it obviously has aims on the future and so forth. I write articles that are called like Compete Report, which, by the way, every time I do, I get feedback from people who say, I think you've misspelled this, by the way. It's supposed to be Complete Report. It's like, no, it's not a complete report. It's a compete report. It's supposed to be compete, so I try to frame it that way.
I'm going to jump over Windows 7 because everybody knows pretty much what it was. But let's go to Windows 8. At what point do you get information that Windows 8 is something totally different? What was the impression like early on when Windows 7 happened? Now we're going into the next version of Windows. What were you thinking it would be?
So with Windows 8, Microsoft was trying to hide what it was doing. And so the early leaked builds, which, say a year before the developer preview where they finally announced it, and then a year to 6 months before, in that time frame. Working with Rafael Rivera, my co-author now on Windows 7 Secrets, Windows 8 Secrets, and now the 8.1 book that we're working on privately, we would investigate these builds. Rafael is an amazing hacker and programmer and can get into the stuff in ways that other people can't. And he would find these things inside it. We're very curious. References to Modern and Metro, and there was a Modern Reader app. There was a Modern version of IE. These things would reference APIs that were kind of hidden or not available or whatever it was, or functions, that are buried in the system. And he would have to code around them to get those things to work. And he was able to open up really basic, versions, like the modern version of Internet Explorer very early on. The modern version of that PDF reader app that's now part of Windows 8.
And what's your reaction to something like that? Where you're like,
well, we didn't understand it. So at the time, if you think about, because we're thinking, it's Windows, right? And so we're thinking, this is sort of like a Silverlight type thing, it seems. Like this is something that it didn't seem like this is going to run on top of the desktop. It's just like another runtime environment. It's like what .NET was, that if you think about the way an Adobe Air app works, or a Windows present, well, that's not a good example, a Silverlight app. Even though they have sort of like a sandbox environment that they run in, which we knew was happening here. It was very clear there was a sandboxing thing going on. we sort of thought of this as stuff that was going to run on top of the desktop because we could make it run on top of the desktop. We could do that. And so there was no reason to believe that wasn't the case. And it wasn't until, Microsoft finally said, okay, this is what we're doing, where you see how they implement it and their ideas for it, that this is going to be something full screen. They never really said it this way, which I think is dumb, but all you have to do is listen to them and look at it and realize this is a mobile computing environment. This is meant to compete with iPad. It's their version of iOS. It's their version of Android. And I don't want to call it innovation, but the unique thing that they did was they enabled it to run in Windows. It became Windows, it runs side by side with the desktop. It doesn't really do this technically, but it treats the desktop as if it were just another app. Very unique approach. Controversial, I think is the easiest way to say it.
But I mean, initially, when you were able to kind of get in there and see it, you had no idea that this is kind of what they're going to do. They're going to do this 2-in-1 operating system where it's mobile, but not.
There are always these questions. I mean, they were talking very early on about doing something called Windows on ARM, and which became Windows RT. And when you sort of realize that this thing is a mobile operating system, that's kind of melded into traditional Windows, and that maybe the Windows and ARM version, maybe they don't need the desktop for that version. Maybe if you think about how the iPad works, I mean, wouldn't you want this to be a standalone thing, kind of like Windows Phone? Oh, in fact, I'm sorry, I should say, we knew about Windows Phone and we knew how Windows Phone worked, and Windows Phone used something called, I think it was called AppX packages, sort of like a zip file format for the self-contained app installs. They were using the 2.0 version of that for Windows 8. Like we kind of knew we thought it would be like Windows Phone running on top of Windows, and it was sort of, but I don't think we had this understanding that it wouldn't occur on top of Windows. Like we thought, you'd be at the desktop and there'd be like this Windows Phone app running there. That's how why wouldn't it be like that?
So to kind of come to the current, when you look back to your career as a tech journalist and a tech blogger and a tech author, what has changed the most for you from the time you started to now? What are some of the major changes? Does social networking obviously impact the way that you write and the way that you get feedback? Like, what's the biggest change for you?
Well, honestly, the basics haven't changed. I mean, I think the revolution that enabled me to do what I do is like this ability to self-publish online and have people find it and read it. I came on one of the proudest moments of my professional life was coming on board at Windows NT Magazine, which was this publication I revered and trusted and respected. And then, of course, we had to change our name like 3 months after I joined the company, which was so aggravating. And if you look at the way things have gone there, traditional magazine publishing almost doesn't occur anymore, and certainly doesn't occur for us, and everything we do is digital. And so I was on board with that stuff very early on. I'm no longer the young kid. I mean, when I started, I was like the little Gutenberg blogger type that you see now from like other tech sites. I was younger and not as mature or not as experienced, certainly. And, now I'm older and more mature, I hope. Certainly more experienced. But
was that some sort of an advantage for you because you a lot of these guys that were covering this stuff were covering it in the 70s, and a lot has changed when you're in the internet world, as far as journalism
I think that
goes.
People go through natural reactions to others. I mean, I'm sure to the traditional media guys, I was uninteresting and not no one to be worried about. And of course, over time, as you establish yourself, that changes. And I look out at some of the young blogger types, and I think, these guys are going to come and go, some of them. And some of them are going to stick around and be meaningful, and some of them are actually pretty smart. And, you get to know some of these people personally, and you realize, there are good and bad people everywhere. It's not a matter of age. It's certainly experience helps. I mean, I have done, road shows for part of work, and I go out and speak in cities around the country and actually in around the world. And I remember doing this years ago with this guy, Zach, who worked at Microsoft, who worked on this terrible product that Microsoft made that I won't name, but later became the guy who I don't know what they call the job, but he worked directly for Bill Gates. He was like Bill Gates' secondhand guy for everyone. Some people get to do that for like 1 year, then you move on. But at the time, he was like a super young guy. We used to goof around with him and joke that he slept in like a car bed with a little, knit hat and everything. But he would say, to the guys like me and the other guys who would speak, he'd be like, you guys have all these great stories. I want to have stories like that. Like, how do I, what do I have to do? And it's like, Zach, you need to live longer. Like these things just happen. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it.
I didn't ask you about podcasting. And how you got into it. I'm going to be interviewing you for the IAIB about podcasting.
Yeah, we can talk about that then. Yep.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in detail. But to kind of touch on it, you started doing a podcast with Leo. Were you doing anything prior to that?
No, and I probably never would have done it on my own. I mean, the only thing I'll just say this. I mean, and I made this comment to a guy who no longer works at Twit. A guy used to handle Leo, back in the day. I mean, he was asking me about, he says, you're really reliable and you show up and blah, blah, blah and all that stuff. And I have this sort of theory about life, like if you want to apply it just to the tech world, I mean, anyone can start a blog, anyone can start a podcast. And the trick is to keep going, and I mean, anyone can start one. It's easy. I told him, this guy at the time at Twit, I said, look, I can't guarantee any quality level. What I can guarantee you is that I'll show up every single week and I'll just do it.
And that's what you said to me. That's exactly those were your words.
It? Okay.
I mean,
okay.
Listen, you were slurring a little bit. We were drinking, but those were the words.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, it's the way I approach things. Yeah. And I've been doing WinInfo since 1994, 95, whatever. I've been doing the SuperSite for Windows since 1998. I've been doing Windows Weekly since 2005, I think, 2005. And I just. I finish things, I think that's the trick. I keep going. Like, it took me a year almost, but I did the Windows phone book. It's 650 pages long. I didn't make a cent doing it, but I set out to do it. I announced my intention to do it, and I did it. And I try to do that, with everything.
But it seems like you enjoy podcasting. You enjoy the broadcasting aspect of what you do.
Now, actually, I'll tell you the other thing I said to Leo. The thing I said to Leo, actually, when we first talked about doing Windows Weekly, he asked me at the time, how do I see a podcast? And I said, look, I see this as an extension of everything I do. I've always thought of this, the SuperSite for Windows is a great example, or WinInfo, the newsletter. This is sort of a conversation. It wasn't like guy in an ivory tower has all the answers to everything. I hate when people say, like Windows expert, Paul Thurrott. I'm not a Windows expert. I've been around for a while. I have whatever perspectives and experiences I have and all that kind of stuff. I don't have all the answers. I want to be really clear about that. It's like 3 or 2 guys sit in a bar and they talk about technology. Yeah. What was your first computer? How do you make Windows boot faster? You have these conversations. This is what people talk about who are into this stuff. And I see this stuff as a conversation. It wasn't always the case. If you send out a newsletter to people, you hear back from some of them and you can respond to those emails. You can go on Twitter and have those conversations directly. You can do it in the comment section now on my blog. People can write in and have questions about the podcast, and we literally have conversations on the podcast. I mean, I think of these things as all being the same kind of thing. It's not about me preaching. I really don't ever want to present myself as the person who has all the answers, because I don't.
I always said that was
talk about this stuff.
When it came to this show that we do, I've always explained it as 2 guys sitting at a bar and talking about tech. They're both they like tech products. I'm not an expert. I'm an enthusiast. Yeah. I never claimed to be one. I like technology. I use everything, and it's almost like there aren't too many people in my life that I could sit and talk to about technology. Yes. that are around me in real life, but like this is almost like a therapy session where I could go and rant and talk about tech and complain about the stuff that I'm complaining about, and to talk about the stuff that I like.
Absolutely. I do these things. I'll go up and I'll speak at an event like I did last week in Las Vegas, or at a user group, which I do locally, and I kind of hate the slideshow thing. Like I'm not very good at that. I can stumble through it and I can do that kind of thing. It's okay. But the thing I really enjoy, and I think the thing if I'm good at anything, it's sort of the Q&A bit. Not because I have an answer, the answer, I should say, but that's when the conversation happens. And I like that stuff. I think that kind of interaction is very useful. And I feel like I have a lot to learn from other people as well.
Early on, I would get emails from people saying like, well, I didn't learn anything this week. Like I listened to the show and I didn't learn anything. And you know, my response would be like, if you want to learn about something, like go to NGAT. Well, don't go to NGAT.
No,
let me change that. Go to ZDNet.
Go to lynda.com and take it. Go to one of the online universities. Go to Big Nerd Ranch and learn how to program.
You're not going to learn anything. You're going to listen to two guys that may or may not have the same opinion.
By the way, maybe you will. I can't. I'm not saying you're not going to learn anything.
I'm not guaranteeing you any kind of education on the show. You may get a little dumber.
I have friends who get to speak to me in ways that most people wouldn't, and I enjoy that kind of stuff. I live for that kind of stuff. I had a friend who showed up unexpectedly at a talk I gave in Boston. He has nothing to do with technology. I didn't see him for a while because he was sitting right in the front. And as I'm suddenly talking, and I realized my buddy Ron from college is here, and we kind of joked about this. And after afterwards we went out for a couple of beers, and I started to say something, and then he kind of went into this thing where it's one of those moments where you realize he knows everything about you and knows exactly what you're going to say and has heard it all before, and he's not impressed by me in the slightest. And I love that. I mean, I love that kind of thing, and I like to be at that point. I don't ever want to take it too seriously.
Yeah.
Or certainly take myself too seriously. And so, whether it's you or Leo or Mary Jo or anybody who kind of gets to know me, it's better that way, because I'm not, like I said, I don't wear a wizard's hat. I don't sit on a throne. I told you I went into the kitchen before the show started, and I said, I guess we're going to have some beer. I said, do you mind bringing me a beer? And my daughter said, are you just being lazy, or are you doing a podcast?
You know what the most amazing
my
part
daughter
of that
gets to talk to me like that. Absolutely. And by the way, my response to her was a little both.
Listen, I think it's great. I mean, we've had a bunch of drinks together, and we've hung out, and Mary Jo and you, and it just everybody's busting each other's balls. I mean, that's pretty much what's happening throughout the entire thing.
You ever watch the show The League?
Yeah, I just started watching it.
Okay, so you're in for some of the best TV that's ever been made. But and by the way, it's a total guys show. I mean, my wife has very little interest in the show, but there is a loving, antagonistic thing that occurs between the guys in the show. They all know each other. The characters in the show. They all know each other because they grew up together. They're all now 40-something adults. They go at each other so aggressively, but with such a sense of joy. I just wish that life was always like that. The sheer joy in which they attack each other, and the sheer okayness of all of it. It's complete fantasy, but I like that kind of thing, and I like when people that I actually know, treat me like that.
I like people treating me like trash.
Yeah.
I welcome. Listen, I don't take myself seriously.
I complimented your wife earlier, and I made a joke about you, but it was a joke. And if you actually got sensitive about that, then it would be like,
this guy.
Yeah, that's too bad.
I what did you say to you? You alluded to me not being a real man because of the stuff that I drink. I mean,
yeah, it is exactly the kind of conversation I have with my son on a daily basis. And by the way, to be very clear, he has with me, right? I mean, if anything, he is more brutal. This is my final comeuppance in many ways, is the fact that my children abuse me on a daily basis. I hope it brings joy to everyone's ears, because they do this in ways that are just. I'm
sure there's going to be a lot of people on Twitter that are excited to hear about that.
The way my son refers to me is amazing. I mean, it really is astonishing.
I got a message a couple weeks ago. I should have sent this to you. Somebody tweeted me and they said, "I really hope that Paul's kids are going to become Mac users."
Right. My daughter does use an iPad, and she uses a MacBook Air, but it's a hand-me-down, and it does run Windows 7. In fact, I told her, I said something to her the other day, recently, not a couple weeks ago, whatever. I said, we could probably upgrade this thing to Windows 8. And she says, I thought this was a Mac. And I said, it is a Mac, but it runs Windows. And she said, it does? She has no idea.
All right, let's wrap it up. What we're going to do right now, we're going to wrap up the show, but I got the Lumia 520 right here. So we're going to do a live unboxing. We're also going to record it. So if you're watching this and you're You've listened to us for about an hour and a half. You know what? You can listen to us for a little bit longer because I'm going to open this thing up and Paul's going to tell me how to set it up. Like I've never set up Lumia before. I've never used one before. That's how we're going to do this.
Before you even take that sucker out of the box,
you
have a Microsoft account?
I do.
Okay.
I do. So I'm all ready to go. We're going to do that live on the air, also on podcast. You know what? Maybe I'll put it up on the podcast on our feed also for people. It might be a little extra bonus. WinSuperSite.com for all things Paul Thurrott. Paul, I thought this was really cool because I interviewed MJ and I learned so much about her. And we do a show. We've been doing a show for, I think it's going to be 2 years in a couple of weeks. And I still learned a lot about you, and it's always great. I love hearing these stories from you. I love hearing about how the website came up and how you got interested in technology. Maybe one day someone will do a really good interview with me. Because I want to talk about myself on a regular basis.
It's going to involve such questions as, why did your wife marry you again?
You know what? People ask her that all the time. All the time.
People, I mean, it's always interesting, by the way, just as an aside, to meet the people who marry people you know.
And you've met her only once, all these times. She never comes out.
Is that true? Only once?
Only one. You met the other one. You met the blonde a couple times.
The other one? Yeah, I met the other one. Yeah. No, but I mean, the guy that got me into writing, I remember thinking, like, what? That guy was a genius, and I mean literally a genius. And I was thinking, like, what kind of woman would be married to this guy? You know? I mean, like, no, seriously, like, what would that be like? You know,
I married a loudmouth.
And she was exactly what he needed. You know,
I married a loud Puerto Rican Italian that is way too smart, and I like to pretend she's not smarter than me, but in reality, she's brilliant.
Right.
And she's easy to look at too. That also is a big help. But I don't know what she sees in me. I really don't, because we got married, and my answer to her was, "Hey, by the way, I'm not going back to work. I'm going to start doing a podcast."
Right. I hope you don't mind supporting me financially.
Yeah. For next whatever.
One of my longest running friends, it was a guy I stayed with when I went up to see Microsoft in the Seattle area for like a decade straight. Once said to me, and I all I can tell you is that I know this guy really well, so I know that he meant this as a compliment, okay? But what came out of his mouth is clearly not a compliment. But what he said to me one time was, he said, I've always really respected you because you had the guts to marry a woman who was smarter than you.
It's actually really well said.
And I'm like, I never really thought that.
I'd be like, I don't know if I should be insulted.
Yeah, no, I pretty clearly needed to be insulted, but he meant it as a compliment.
We're in SuperSite.com for all things Paul, at Thurrott on Twitter. I'm at Andrew Zarian on Twitter. You can follow me. I tweet a lot about Pinot Grigio and beer. That's pretty much all I write about, and sometimes I talk about technology. Sometimes. I do a multitude of shows covering everything from just like a Howard Stern type show to hair loss. Everything is here on the GFK Network. So if you're looking for hair loss talk and shock jock humor, and of course technology, this is the place to be. Also, one more thing, guys. The Amazon thing, I'm going to remind you guys, if you want to support the GFK Network, you could click on our Amazon affiliate link. gfq.co/Amazon is the link. We get a tiny little portion from every sale, and it helps us get stuff like this. The Lumia 520 that we're going to review right after this. So stay tuned, and we'll see you all next week, guys. So take care.